I'm reading a book called At the Edge of Empire, The Life of Thomas Blake Glover by Michael Gardner. Chapter 1, Dajima. Early afternoon, 19 September. At 33 degrees, the weather is typical for Nagasaki. The wisterias are a lilac deep enough to cling to the clothes. The dragonflies are aircraft circling the ponds. The cicadas are deafening. Cicadas only sing for a few weeks, then fall from the trees and cover the ground like walnut shells. They have to sing deafeningly to be heard over the mobile phones. Below, a view of a long channel leading into a bay. Down there, the protagonist sailed into Japan on 19th September 1859. 1859 was not a year of a typical weather. The dragonflies were subject to delays. The cicadas were too confused to sing themselves to death, and the passengers of Thomas Glover's ship had no view of the city, because the fog was too thick. On a clearer day, Glover would have seen large mountains crowding in over him, an island chain funneling him into the harbor and off to the east. Nagasaki city center, which will be officially off limits until the last few years of his life. This is the scene looking down from the Glover garden, set around the cruciform houses, which was his and later became a tourist attraction. Here, the turmoil of the 1860s is suggested, its civil wars, its assassinations, and its intrigues. A busload of tourists stroll past, some turning the bells of flowers upwards to their noses. The tourists talk to one another, making a point of not listening to the young guide. They have earned the right not to. What the guide might be trying to explain as she passes the imperious European-looking house on the hill is something like this. Thomas Glover had a hand in the education of some of the samurai, the ruling caste of a Japanese society, who would become influential politicians after the change of governments in 1868. He sold the Japanese Imperial Navy its first great ships and the equipment to become self-sufficient. He was the country's first major industrialist in the European sense. He was involved with the project to create Japan's first mint. He founded the first modern domestic brewing company, which later became Kirin. He helped set the scene. The guide is less likely to be saying, for an Anglo-Japanese relationship that ensured alliance in World War I. With his son, he introduced the troll fishing to the country. He came, it says in a garden brochure, to Nagasaki in 1859 and established the Glover and Company, a trading business and a shipping agency. Later, he was instrumental in the introduction of shipbuilding, coal mining, railways, and various other modern industries to Japan. He was also a staunch supporter of the young samurai and the feudal clans rebelling against the feudal government, and in that way he played a vital role in the turbulent political changes in Japan at the time of the Meiji Restoration. The word staunch flattens Glover's life into one span dedicated to forces understood in anachronistic terms as pro-democracy. But as a free trading entrepreneur, Many of his actions were improvised, inconsistent, and dictated by changing circumstances. Still, this biography has also been the version of the Glover story usually told in Scotland. Glover was a modern. He inspired Madame Butterfly. He was a staunch. Glover himself might have humphed at this. His version of the story might have been a bit more raw. He was born into a middling position in a big family. He had a few educational opportunities, was a rowdy in school, and was possessed of a restless desire to make himself heard, which was as likely to get him into trouble as to bring him success. When an opportunity to leave home came up, it his more educated older brothers. He grew up around the smile not of a wisteria, but of a herring, which sucked in fishermen from around northern Europe. He befriended foreign traders around the harbors, and early in life learned to associate strange shapes with opportunity. A gruff personability, financial ambition, and sheer luck would turn him into a linchpin of a modern Japanese government. He was willing to take great risks to achieve his ambitions, and he developed a knack of putting himself in the right place at the right time. So after his own lifetime, Glover disappeared from public view. This wasn't because he didn't have a high standing in Nagasaki. By the time of his passing, he was seen as an asset on the national level. Diplomatic histories bypassed the lives of traders in their memoirs, and the traders didn't write much. Soon after his death, his adopted homeland was starting to look like an enemy of the country of his birth. Only in the early 1980s was it realized that the early days of modern Japan could be related to a Scot. But the haiku, modern butterfly stanch, made to avoid any talk of violence, can come to look like a form of aggression in itself. In Japan, it is better understood that past war and present friendship are not mutually exclusive. Anyone who has visited the atomic bomb museums in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki will have seen how horrifying atrocities can be remembered in an atmosphere which encouraged calm and internationalism. The atomic bomb museums are amongst the friendliest and most afterward-looking space in the country. And Glover didn't succeed by obeying protocol. His straight-talking nature got negotiating with the samurai who were waiting to behead him when he arrived in the harbor down there in September 1859. He spent much of his life looking out from under these trees at this harbor. He made his livelihood here, as the town filled with ships, some of which he had built himself. The first few years of Glover's stay in Japan are the part of his life best remembered, often the only part remembered. His late teens and 20s were lived in a frantic rate that couldn't be sustained indefinitely and had to crash. For Oliver Checkland, Glover is a good example of a man who found the excitement of the Japanese trade more hazardous than he had bargained for. The familiar young Glover of 1859 to 1865 was far from home, often in desperate company, and much more lonely than his ability to network implies. His level of activity during this period demonstrates less a feeling of being staunch than a feeling of being lost. Glover fact-finding represents a relatively new field, and a cultural comparison a non-existent one. After the first scattered journalistic forays into Gloverology in Scottish newspapers, the first serious book-length account was Brimberg Gaffney's Hanatu Shimo, Garabeki no Hitobito. In the UK, Alex Mackay's Scottish Samurai, 1993, broke the field and became the authoritative record, the product of years of painstaking research. In 2001, Nato Natsuoho published a massive record of Glover's movements, Meiji Kankoku no Yosho, Thomas B. Galoba no Shimas, which remains by far the most complete book written on him. Mackay, Burke Gaffney, and Nato are the pioneers in Glover scholarship, and their labors over primary material make a work like this possible. A lot of new material has been discovered since then, but rather than being exhaustive, it combines a look at Glover's life, which repitched stories of his time. Mackay's book was, as they say, timely. Despite Glover's involvement in Japanese government and technology, there remained an odd silence surrounding him in official histories of Japan. As early as July 1984, the Keio University economist Sugiyama Shiina had been expressing surprise that no substantial study of Glover's business activities seems yet to have been made. Alike, he partly answered in 1993 with his own Meiji Ishin to Igarashi Shonin, Glover's diplomat friend Ernest Suttle, and had set the tone early by leaving him after his important memoirs of 1921. Even though the two had worked out pro-samurai strategies with global implications, after this, things went quiet for decades. Glover failed to get a mention by any of the contributors to Hugh Gottazzi's Victories in Japan, 1987, which charts the progress of important foreigners in the Meiji period. He doesn't appear once in the Cambridge History of Japan, the 19th century, which runs to over 1,000 pages and is otherwise thorough on political movements. Nor, for that matter, does he appear in Hamishi Fraser and Clevele's Aberdeen, 1800 to 2000, A New History, 2000, over 500 pages itself. And before Naito Hatsuho's huge volume, little reliable material was published about Glover in Japan. The garden, which is a flower-watching tour parties, has been known as a peaceful place with wonderful views over city and sea, not as a center of research. His story is important to Japan, but this is not to say that he is simply revered. The city of Nagasaki has been in a tricky position, since although not every act of Glover's career was as wholesome as they might like, vital revenue comes from a form of tourism that shows this era as one of a movement forward. Since 1957, when Mitsubishi gave Glover House to the city of Nagasaki, the city has used the garden as a taste of the West, echoing the free trade principles of Glover himself. It features authentic Western houses built by an architect who had never left Japan, filled with models of period furniture, the original contents having been cleared out. Today, with its quite winding paths, teeming with kites, the area of the garden is an oasis in the city. Nagasaki is one of Japan's most attractive cities, but like all Japanese cities, it's short on public space. The garden looks down on another oasis, the Dajima Harbor Boardwalk, where various chain cafes and bars are now lined up. In Dajima, I made waiters sheepish about their English without speaking. This is typical for medium-sized cities. Sometimes it is easier to go along with the semaphore and the pointing. This was the relationship that Glover perfected, one he helped to introduce, and it has never gone away. One belief is that Glover conducted all his dealings in a native language. In fact, he dealt almost entirely in English, gradually slackening his study of Japanese, and this increased his value amongst internationally minded samurai rather than decreasing it, just as it does for foreigners today, when it is still common for English conversation instructors to pretend to have no Japanese to increase their popularity. It is easy to see why Glover spent most of his life in this city. Nagasaki is, by Japanese standards, open, spacious, and leafy. There really is something historical beneath the historical. World-changing things really did take place here. The traders of the 1860s did look down from these luxurious Western-style houses on the hill onto ships in the channel, and those ships did stop here on their way to battles that would dictate how people would be governed for centuries. Foreign traders did bolt themselves into the house of William Ott next door, after finding themselves in the eye of a war between rebels and allied foreign forces. Settlers' houses were torched without warning. Collaborators were assassinated around them, and huge amounts of cash did change hands. For over 50 years, Glover struggled to make Japan modern, as in the first epithet of the memorial haiku. What is missing from the brief accounts of Glover's legacy is how modern is easy to confuse with better. For Mohandas Gandhi, for example, the modern was not a necessary and a natural step, but a sign of indebtedness to Europe. The leader of what would become the world's most populous country spent much of his latter years spinning cotton. A lot of Asia still actively avoids the modern, in its common sense of globalization with unfettered capital. But in a country that had been strongly restricted for 2 centuries, Glover found the most Europhile market he could have hoped for. In newly opened Japan, becoming modern was quickly defined as chasing a cultural and economic ideal already reached elsewhere. A central example remains language, and as in the semaphore waiter catching up with my silent English. Before I could answer even his question, there was the problem of Glover's nationality, which paradoxically threatened to hide some of the most substantial information. When my own nationality was discovered, answers seemed to appear before the questions were asked. Gathering information began to feel like celebrating an alumnus for a school magazine. Because Glover was Scottish, I was existing my pride. Was I? Was he? I must have been muttering, because our garden groundkeeper looked up from his hoeing. He looked up at the clear sky, sliced by the trails of aircraft bringing more tour parties, then nodded to me. I said something about how Glover is always described as Scottish. He smiled and went back to hoeing. No, I said, listen. Glover is almost always described as a Scot and almost never as a Briton. The stress on nationality has become a kind of a moral duty. But to describe someone at national level is a conscious choice. And in Scotland's case, it's a particularly active choice. Since British is a definite category, while Scottish is indefinite, there is no Scottish body equivalent to the Foreign Office. The word Scotland does not appear on any passport. At the time of writing, there is no Scottish state. Scottishness resists definition because it isn't an official status. It's an elective identity. People choose to be Scottish. To say that someone is Scottish is not to state a fact, but to make a judgment. For some people, usually those who see themselves as liberal, being born within the borders of a nation is enough to qualify as Scottish. Few of these people, however, would see themselves as sharing a national heritage with their neighbors whose parents are from Poland. Now would most accept that if they moved to Canada, they could no longer have Scottish children. For others, Scottishness is about a parentage. But this is a circular explanation, since parents' nationality depends on their parents, which depends on their parents, and so on forever. Besides which, the first thing we find out about Glover's father, Thomas Berry, is that he was English. If we go by the parentage argument, Glover was a half Scottish samurai. Other people think that Scots become Scots through environment. But Glover spent 52 years of his 73-year life in Japan. He was born in Frisburg, quite safely in Scotland. Much of his childhood was spent in Bridge of Don, near Aberdeen, and he may have spent three formative years as two of his father's posts, near Grimsby. But this means that he spent only a total of 15 to 18 of his 73 years in Scotland. This was a central question. Since national pride is always somehow involved in the Glover story, I showed the gardener both versions of the garden brochure and pointed out how the descriptions of the man differed. In Japanese, the term to describe Glover remains Iso, meaning both English merchant and British merchant. E connotes both Britain and England. For visitors, his success is inextricable from his being a kind of English gentleman. A typology still large in the popular imagination. It is only in the English version of the brochure that he becomes a Scottish merchant. His nature in a garden in Nagasaki had him as English until it was very visibly changed, probably in 1999. When I asked the garden manager about it, he didn't remember the inscription ever having been altered. Despite the heavy scrap marks on the inscription, he didn't seem keen on the subject of the inscription at all, and pointed me back towards the views. Unsurprisingly, the reinscription of a Scottishness on the statue has been tacitly claimed as a moral victory. A cutting from the Aberdeen Evening Express of 6 January 1999 describes one couple protesting too much by taking no credit. Mrs. Sunley said, "We only found out when we were sent a postcard by our friend Katsuko Takashita, which shows Englishman on the plaque changed to Scotsman. She knows the mayor of Nagasaki and mentioned it to him when we told her about the mistake." One reason for the alteration is doubtless the phrase attributed to Alex Mackay, but probably originating with newspaper headline writers of the 1980s. Mackay's Scottish Samurai has been influential in Nagasaki and was prominent in both English and Japanese translation on a bookshelf in the garden manager's office. The gardener chuckled in a way that told me he was a bored Steve. He bent down to tend a row of pansies. After a few seconds, he straightened, looked pensive, and told me that he didn't know much about the Scotland stuff, but that if I wanted to find out about Glower, there were other ways. This was part of the city had been left relatively intact by the atomic bomb, which had hit further east, and it had, after all, been born less than a century since Glower has died. He took out a notebook from the pocket of his overalls and leafed through it, then made notes on the last blank page. He tore the page out and handed it to me. I almost trod on his flowers to take the page from him, then stepped back and unfolded. It was a list of phone numbers. That's the end of chapter 1.